Hello and welcome to the World Energy Council's Joint Memory Committee. Today, we will present you the results of our study project, International Hydrogen Strategies, a project we did together with the consulting company LBST, Ludwig-Bölkow-Systemtechnik, and I'm happy that Albrecht, the managing director of LBST, is with us today to present the results to all of you. For those of you who are not aware who the World Energy Council really is, just a few words at the beginning. The World Energy Council is a truly global energy network covering all energy technologies, and we are present in about 9 countries on all continents worldwide. We are organizing the World Energy Congress since almost 100 years now, and providing the energy scene with study work and network meetings in order to promote the sustainable supply and use of energy for the greatest benefit of all people. What was the motivation for us to do this study project we want to present today? This winter I had the feeling, attending many energy conferences, that hydrogen is on all of the conferences one of the very big issues to be discussed. Some people already spoke about a second hype of hydrogen. But the big question is, what is really going on there? And we wanted to learn from our network who is really formulating a hydrogen strategy, an official government strategy. What can we learn from these strategies? What are targets? What are sectors of first implementation? What are measures and policy instruments we can learn from? Are there any recommendations we can derive from these strategies? What do they have in common and how do they differ? And to do so, we looked, the next slide, into several strategies a bit more in depth. If I look back on this timeline that you see here, it all began probably with the hydrogen strategy of 2017, a very comprehensive one and well perceived by the energy scene, very detailed, and maybe the outstanding one at the beginning most people refer to. And roughly 2 years later, 2019, South Korea followed with, again, a very comprehensive and very remarkable strategy. But these two were more or less outstanding. France had a smaller one in between, but for long these were the official government strategies the energy scene was looking at. And this changed just more or less a year ago in winter 2019, with Australia, now coming more from the expert side, formulating an own hydrogen strategy, and many European countries following, with Norway, the Netherlands and its remarkable strategy, Spain, the European Commission in the summer, and now in the last couple of weeks, Portugal and France with its second strategy followed. And we know there are more countries out there who are preparing a strategy. Russia is just about finalizing its strategy, publishing it, and similar work is going on in China and Morocco, for instance. So what we did then in first place was to ask the members of our World Energy Council network, and doing our own analysis, what's going on globally. And we got feedback from 56 countries on their hydrogen work from all continents. And the first finding is, at the moment, there are 9 national hydrogen strategies, governmental strategies out there, and there's another 11 countries preparing a hydrogen strategy. And you see the different colors, the different blues. The lighter it gets, the less intensive is the work going on, at least from a governmental point of view. There are other countries that at least have some project work going on. And this is maybe the first quite remarkable result of our study project, a global map of the hydrogen activities that you can see here. And our intention is to really work with this map for the future, have it as an interactive tool on our website. And whenever you receive news of what has changed, what's going on, please let us know so we can really make sure that this is the most recent place to have an overview of what's going on in the hydrogen world globally. Now, if we take all this together, we see that national strategies that are in place, or at least in preparation, in these roughly 20 countries at the moment, are quite remarkable, because these countries are important countries and there are more heavyweights to come. So our expectation would be that at least by the mid-2020s, more or less 80% of the represented GDP by countries should have a hydrogen strategy. So it is not only a debate going on in Germany or in singular countries, but more and more countries are involved. And now look in at least 16 countries more in depth. With this, I'd like to hand it over to Uwe Albrecht.
Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to take over and guide you in the next 15 minutes or so through the detail of the study that's been done there. So yes, the clear answer that Carsten just mentioned is it's not a hype. It is something that has a purpose and is serving a clear target setting within each country. And what type of targets this is shows the layout here of the 16 countries plus the European Union that we have chosen for the more in-depth analysis. Now, what you see here is that it firstly is a very heterogeneous picture. So obviously the targets that we have grouped in reducing emission, diversifying energy supply, fostering economic growth, but also supporting national technology development and so forth, that differs unsurprisingly between the countries. However, if we aggregate that and look, well, where are the focus areas of each country and what is more dominant in the target setting, we see very clearly that we have two themes that are being followed by these countries. One theme is the environment. The reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and the integration of renewable energy into the energy systems are two prime targets. So the international thrust towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a clear driver behind national advocacy for hydrogen. The other clear driver, and that is a very nice combination actually, is that it is perceived as one way and one opportunity to foster economic growth, either through direct energy generation and energy use within the countries, and in combination with national technology development. You have to figure that many of these hydrogen technologies are, on the one hand, based on existing technology, but they have to be scaled, and it is expected that this is an industry that will grow strongly over the coming years. So being part of that development is one aspiration of these countries as well. So there's a strong combination of environmental aims and economic aims, and that's also what makes hydrogen such an attractive proposition for many countries. You will also see that some countries, and I'll get to that in a minute, are aiming at developing hydrogen for export. This is not necessarily representative, that this bar here is a bit shorter than the others, but it's based on the selection of the countries that we have taken. That was a previous study by the World Energy Council that is accessible on the World Energy Council website that targeted export countries for hydrogen in particular. So we only picked a few here to be representative, but on a global scale, this is not necessarily the split that you will see in general, just as a word of caution. But clearly, hydrogen is recognized as an essential element in a decarbonized energy system, and that is one of the underlying reasons why this is unlikely to be a hype that goes away soon, because this need and this requirement will not disappear, but rather become stronger and more important in the coming years. That is also connected with national aspirations of hydrogen demand. many of the strategies are not quantitative, but rather qualitative. But a lot of the strategies and national papers that prepare for strategies mention hydrogen consumption on the domestic level and certain demand figures. And this graph shows that as it grows until 2050 and beyond. And if you take the countries that are out there that do mention qualitative figures, and you do put that in relation to the GDP of these countries, you get into a rather surprisingly narrow ballpark with regard to hydrogen need per economic power, per GDP. So if you scale that up, you actually end up with the global potential of 9,000 terawatt hours of hydrogen, or 270 million tons of hydrogen by 2050, which is surprisingly similar to some of the bottom-up calculations that you find in some studies of the global hydrogen demand. And it is a very large figure. It's about as much as half of the primary energy consumption of the EU 28 today. So on a global level, quite a significant figure for hydrogen generation. Also telling you that hydrogen is certainly not the answer for every question, but as I pointed out before, it will be an important element in the energy system of the future, and it is increasingly perceived as such throughout the developed world and industrialized countries. In many countries, particularly densely populated countries like Germany, Japan, and Korea, with a high industry base, a high energy need, and maybe a limited potential of producing renewable energy within the country, the perception is that not all of the nationally required hydrogen demand can be served by domestically produced renewable energy. Be that for mere constraints in the technical potential, but rather in most cases also by constraints in the economic potential, or the potential that is perceived to be acceptable as a deployment by the population. So particularly in these three countries mentioned here, Germany, Korea, and Japan, but also in a few other countries less so, though there is a notion that a significant part of the hydrogen that's going to be used in the future should be imported from other areas where it can be produced more abundantly and probably also more economically. And what this graph shows you here is sort of the arms that the respective countries have already extended into these international regions that have the ability to produce hydrogen at interesting rates and can conceivably transport it to the countries of the demand. And at the end of the day, what we see is that not only imports and exports, for that matter, will become important, but we also see that at least initially, which means in the next couple of decades or so, this import-export relationship will primarily be based on bilateral agreements. Also because it requires significant investment. You need to invest for the production capacity in the exporting countries, and you need to invest into the transport and supply infrastructure along the supply chain. And that investment needs to be secured by corresponding contracts, and these will initially occur on a bilateral basis. You will have seen the two dark projects coming out from Japan. Some of you may have already heard about that. Those are projects that are already in the demonstration stage, carrying hydrogen via liquid organic carriers from Brunei and via liquid hydrogen from Australia. I've been talking about the demand before. Obviously, demand is driven by certain hydrogen consuming sectors, and in the same way as we looked at the targets earlier, we can look at the target sectors of the respective national strategies. Again, a quite heterogeneous picture, but if you condense that up, you can clearly see that at least in the near term, more important and more imminent sectors are transport and industry. Transport, because there is a strong need to decarbonize transport, and there are not too many alternatives, and not everything can be done by battery electric transport. And industry, because as in transport, there are certain industry areas that are very hard to decarbonize otherwise, but where you can substitute a lot of carbon emissions by green hydrogen and reduce emissions accordingly. And industry covers very large hydrogen amounts. Transport is obviously more granular and area wide issue, but both are important. It doesn't mean that the other sectors are less important, but they're rather expected to follow suit in the coming decades, not as much in this current decade. So initial applications focus on transport and the industry sector. Obviously, there will be a national differentiation, very much depending on the industry basis that you have in the respective countries, and also on the role that the various transport means play. In Germany and in the European Union, there's been a lot of talk about the so-called color of hydrogen. Emission-free hydrogen does not necessarily mean green hydrogen. You can also produce hydrogen that is low emission by other means, and those are the colors that are used. Green hydrogen is the term used for hydrogen produced from renewable energy exclusively, so typically from renewable electricity in an electrolyzer. Blue hydrogen is low carbon hydrogen from fossil sources, where you combine the production of hydrogen typically from carbohydrates like methane in, for example, steam methane reforming with carbon capture and sequestration. So you take the carbon dioxide that is produced in this process, capture it and sequester it safely and essentially extract it from the process. The gray hydrogen is the fossil hydrogen that is being used already today in the chemical industry, for example, or the petrochemical industry. And then there's lastly a process called methane pyrolysis, where at very high temperatures you crack methane, which is carbon and hydrogen, CH4. You crack that and you're left with carbon powder and pure hydrogen. That is a process that is being developed in Germany to some extent and in Russia. And it pops up as a result in the Russian and German strategies and also in the EU strategies. So it remains to be seen what role it plays. The important notion and the important result that we found in analyzing the international strategies is that in the short to midterm, you will find all colors in the strategies. Of course, even gray hydrogen, but almost always with an aim to gradually substitute that by more low carbon variants. Whereas in the long term, towards 2050, with the international aim to be pretty much zero carbon, it becomes very green. So green hydrogen is sort of at the top of the list in almost all the strategies. Some strategies would still see blue hydrogen, which is low carbon hydrogen as well, as part of the game. Maybe purple hydrogen or turquoise, I think, hydrogen in the Russian strategy, but very little gray hydrogen going forward. So you see a pronounced color change going forward in the strategies, and the future is expected to be a lot greener than the present. The summary of that, or if you look at the pathway towards that more or less green future, most strategies see 2 or 3 steps towards that. In this current decade, everybody expects a market activation phase where technology is being scaled, where incentives are being created to initiate early markets, which can then grow. Then beyond that decade, there will be a second phase where this initial markets will then enter into a growth phase, whereas in the final phase, most strategies expect a mature market development and an established hydrogen market going forward. So these 3 phases are pretty common to all the strategies and all the national views that we have analyzed. So, summarizing the overall market outlook, yes, it's not a hype. National strategies are in place or are being prepared and announced for the next month in at least 20 countries, covering, and already these 20 countries cover almost half of the global GDP. This is expected to continue throughout the decade, and by mid to end of this decade, we expect over 80% countries with over 80% representation of the global GDP to have hydrogen strategies. Remember the 9,000 terawatt hours or 270 million tons of demand that we can extrapolate from that. Part of that will not be produced nationally, but served by imports, particularly in countries with a very high need. And it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the import will be based on bilateral agreements, which means if you're an industry player interested in that kind of business, the time to engage is now. Don't push it out too far. Transport and industry will be the initial sectors addressed, and green is the color, at least in 2050, whereas in the mean term, we will see all kinds of mixtures transitioning to that green or blue phase in some sense in these 3 market phases that I had just explained previously. Now, moving on towards the end of our presentation today, with a look at what does this mean for industry, and then after that, what are the policy expectations and the policy recommendations that we can gather from the analysis. Well, from an industry perspective, one clear and interesting understanding is that this is a large market requiring large investment. A lot of the strategies mention hydrogen targets for hydrogen production capacities and quite large hydrogen production capacities. There's a 40 gigawatt electrolyzer capacity mentioned for 2030 in the European Union strategy. And this alone for the electrolyzers balance of plant, and not even counting the supply chains associated with that alone is a 40 billion investment cumulative until 2030. From today's perspective, it's actually likely to be a lot larger. So there is money to be spent, there is money to be made. Large industrial partnerships will be formed because all these connections between hydrogen production, the logistics along the supply chain, and hydrogen use require the cooperation between the respective actors and stakeholders along this value and supply chain. And partnerships are being formed already today, like in the import-export, to facilitate that. I've talked about the transport and the industry markets. In the industry markets in particular, it's worth mentioning that refineries and the chemical industry are expected to become the first adopters or first important larger scale green hydrogen markets in the midterm, also because there are policies like the Renewable Energy Directive recast in Europe incentivizing certain applications in these industries. When looking at the transport sector, one important point to keep in mind, and it's quite noteworthy, is that there's a pronounced strategy difference between Asia. In the Asian countries, predominantly Korea, Japan, and China, the road transport, also on the small end, so passenger vehicles and small vehicles, small trucks, are seeing a lot stronger push for hydrogen and fuel cells than in Europe, where the transport sector is more focusing on more heavy-duty applications. So that's one difference. Another difference, which is not mentioned on this slide, is that also the fuel cell market in the residential sector is more pronounced in Asia than in Europe. So I'm just mentioning that neutrally, but it's important to keep that in mind. One of the strategies is probably closer to the future, and it's worth watching both markets to see how things pan out. And last but not least, there's also a lot of discussion, not just about hydrogen, but about other fuels that can be derived from hydrogen, green synthetic carbohydrate liquid fuels, for example. They can also be an interesting opportunity, particularly in, for example, the aviation and the maritime sector, where hydrogen can play a role, but at least on the interim, green synthetic liquid fuels can also play a role, and they're mentioned as such in some strategies. However, it is fair to say that, as the name says, hydrogen strategies typically focus on hydrogen and not on the other energy carriers that you can produce from it. Now, interestingly, while most of the hydrogen strategies have particular targets, mention at times even quantitative targets for deployment, the hydrogen strategies are not policies. Generally, the strategies focus on targets rather than on measures, and the policies and policy instruments to implement and incentivize the path towards these targets are not part of the strategies, but need to be part of the policy-making process that follows the strategies. It's fair to say that the current measures, be that on a European level or on the national level, either in France or in Germany or in other countries, are insufficient to catalyze the strong growth that the strategies foresee. Now, however, we can look at the past to see which instruments have shown to be successful within the limits that we can use, and that gives us an indication of what we can expect policy-wise in the coming years. And those are sectoral quota, like we do have them in the Renewable Energy Directive. They're a very attractive instrument from a policy perspective because they don't cost initial money from the taxpayer. So that's something we can expect, and those quota create markets that also attach a higher price to green hydrogen, for example. What has been quite successful in Europe and in countries like Germany as well is public support for establishing comprehensive value chains, i.e. moving from isolated demonstration projects to value chain demonstrations. Also moving from investment support to supporting the operating expense of a project is important because that provides a long-term perspective, if done well, and potential security of investment for stakeholders that are contemplating investing in the sector. And the carbon contracts for difference that are being discussed in the European strategy serve as one example of such OPEX support type of instruments. And last but not least, it's fair to say that high carbon prices obviously help to reduce the cost gap that currently exists between fossil solutions and green solutions. Overarching, a green or low carbon hydrogen certification is important to be established because that provides security to the buyer that if I buy a green commodity, that it is actually green, and I can sort of mark and understand the actual green quality of the product that I buy, and it's also important for the seller because that attributes that green value to the product in a certifiable way. Infrastructure has to be developed. Pipeline infrastructures can be very effective and cost effective for high volume transport, also over large distances. And markets cannot be left alone to erect such a comprehensive Europe-wide or nationwide infrastructure. So public support for planning, harmonization, but also for financing is key for infrastructure deployment. And a very last point, but a very important point, there must be measures ensuring public support. We're all seeing across Europe what lack of public understanding for certain policies can create, and that's a risk one should not incur with a new technology like hydrogen here. So I hope that gave you a good overview of the results. The World Energy Council, as well as we as the study team, will be open and for any questions you may have. So please feel free to contact us directly, and we'll do what we can to answer any questions you may have or establish the right contacts if need be. Thanks a lot for your patience and for your interest.
Thank you very much, Uwe. I think to summarize in a word, the governmental commitment is rising, but it's still a long way to go. And there's a lot to, especially when it comes to the policy instruments that you just mentioned at the end. These were the key results in a nutshell in our presentation. I hope that was interesting and helpful for you. You make use of it in your business environment. If there's more interest, you can read the full study in English language on our website, including all the country profiles. And basically, we will working and keep on working on the subject, and we hope that you will be with us. Thank you very much for your attention, and bye-bye.